Thanks once again for joining us on Biblically Grounded. I'm Clayton Van Huss, your host, and today we are going to continue our discussion with Dr. Douglas Petrovich about finding the Tower of Babel in the historical and archaeological record. Dr. Petrovich, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Clayton. It's great to be back with you and
Yes.
your viewers as well.
Well, it's great having you back. You're always a joy to talk to. So, a little bit of background, Dr. Petrovich. You are currently professor of Old Testament history and exegesis at Brooks Bible College.
Yes, professor of biblical history and exegesis at Brooks Bible College, and the college is located in St. Louis, but I'm in the Houston area, and so I'm always teaching remotely.
Yes, and you've done many things in your past. You're an archaeologist, an epigrapher, you're an author. You helped to start a seminary, I believe, somewhere
Yes,
else in the world.
in
And
Siberia, Russia, of all places.
yeah, how cool is that? Like, do
Yeah,
you
it's really cool and even very cold.
yeah, thanks. I understand that you learned Russian just to go there and do that.
Yes, once I got there, I learned it. In fact, I was recruited also to plant a church in the area where I lived. So eventually, it didn't happen at first, but eventually I was preaching every week in Russian every Sunday.
Wow, that is amazing. Of course, I know that you are an excellent language professor. You were my professor of Hebrew at the Bible Seminary, as well as other biblical classes, Bible study methods, and different archaeological classes. So you're a man with many skills, and it's great to be hearing from you on this. So, this week's subject, we've been talking about the Tower of Babel, and I'm just give a little recap for those who missed last week. We talked about the biblical setting for Babel on the Plain of Shinar. We talked about these structures that we find around the world that are similar to Mesopotamian ziggurats, which is a pyramid type building stepped with usually an outward staircase. I know there's a technical definition for ziggurat. I understand that. So we find these buildings that historically match up with what the Bible says about the Tower of Babel being baked brick and bitumen as the mortar. So we find a number of these towers in Mesopotamia, but you have done some work to try to narrow it down, and it sounds like you've come up with something.
Yeah, and it comes down to this, Clayton. Before the advent of writing, and that's what we use as the measuring stick to divide prehistory or the prehistorical period. We separate that from the historical period. It's the period after the advent of writing. So in the time before writing began, and that's for sure what has to be the case for the events that we read about in the Tower of Babel, there are only two outward movements of people from Mesopotamia. There's the Ubaid expansion, that's the earlier one, and then there's the second one, which is the Uruk expansion. And so what I studied in comparing and contrasting these two movements of people outwardly from Mesopotamia, and really the reason I wanted to study them is to see if one of them rose above the other, and maybe that would indicate for us this almost certainly, or the other is the right outward movement of people that we can match with what I call the post-Babel dispersion, when God confused the languages and the people scattered from that area. So in comparing the two, Clayton, the first one, the Ubaid expansion, this expansion is characterized by peaceful migration and non-intrusive relocation. What does that mean? Well, in both cases, in both expansions, people moved outward from southern Mesopotamia. It wasn't trade, it was actually physically moving. And if they would go during the Ubaid expansion, if they would go to a site where there were already people there, what would happen is they would integrate with those people and live together. In fact, one of the sites, it's called Degirmentepe. It's in ancient Syria. We have people who moved from southern Mesopotamia. We can call them Ubaidians for ease. And so the Ubaidians physically moved way up to the northwest into Syria at this site called Degir Mentepe. And when they moved there, they built houses that were amongst the houses of the local people, and all of the houses were contiguous, which means they had shared walls. Now, if you have an enemy, you're not going to have shared walls, one house to the next, with that kind of person. So clearly, there is an element of peaceful harmony that exists among the local people who experienced the influx of immigrants from somewhere else and moved there. So it was a natural, peaceful integration. And if they did move to a place, the people from southern Mesopotamia, they did move to a place where there were already people. It was a non-intrusive relocation. In other words, they didn't go there and attack them. They didn't try to take over the city. They weren't threats to society. It was all harmonious, right? So this is how you can characterize the Ubaid expansion pretty much across the board at all the sites in the ancient world that you look at where this expansion took place, whether that was in Syria or in just above Mesopotamia, above the Tigris River. There's a site called Tepegara. You can look at the Ubaidian people who moved there, and it was very peaceful, right? So you can contrast that with this second outward expansion called the
Okay,
Uruk expansion.
before we get into the Uruk expansion, just a couple of things on the Ubaid expansion.
Mhm.
First of all, where do we find that in the historical record? Like, what year are we looking at here?
Well, how you date the year is a hard one, Clayton. There's going to be a lot of contentiousness over that. But I'll give you my ballpark figure. So with the Ubaid expansion, I would put it right around 2825 BC. And that date, and that's a rough date. It's not an exact date, but I think that's right about the right time period for when this would have taken place. But this is based on a date of the flood. That's one of two options. I'm convinced that there's only two options that can work. One is 3158 BC, and the other is 3298 BC. So those are the only two options I think that work. And
Right,
so,
and that goes off of the text, the biblical texts, and the genealogies and things like that, and we do have in a couple of different traditions some numbers that are a little different.
right, and that's the Genesis 11 textual variants, and I take um, the the harmonious reading in the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch as correct there, rather than the Masoretic text. And so what that does in effect is it takes the date of the flood back in time from roughly 2400 something BC to 31 or 3200 something BC.
Right, so you're putting the Ubaid expansion somewhere in the 29th century BC.
Yes.
So you mentioned something else I want to talk in case anyone missed last week. We have this Sunday school idea. And I say Sunday school, I don't mean that as an insult. I'm a Sunday school teacher. I love Sunday school. I think it's extremely important. But we have this idea that comes from our idea of Bible stories and flannel graphs and things, that everybody in the world, everybody on the whole planet was at Babel when this incident happened, but that's not necessarily the case. Archaeologically, we find that people were living in places like Jericho or Megiddo, some of these sites in Turkey, some of these like Göbekli Tepe and sites like that are ancient. So not everyone was in this location. And when you talk about the expansion and the peaceful interactions with those who are leaving Mesopotamia and coming into other areas, there are already people living in other places at this point, correct?
That's right. So from the time of God's instruction to Noah after the flood, he explained that they are to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, right? That's the mandate, and basically it's a repetition of the mandate that Adam received, and so all of Adam's offspring and people who came from his line, they were expected to follow that instruction, and the same goes with Noah. God expected people to follow that model and spread out over the earth, so they did do that. That's what the archaeological record shows us. And we have to be careful that we don't impose on the biblical text this idea that the Bible itself is saying that they all gathered in one place. The text does not say they all gathered together in one place. It says in their spreading out, uh, they came to a place and then events happened there, right? So it's not talking about all the other places where people went, but it is talking about one of the places where people went.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So now you're ready to step into another expansion. Can you place that on your timeline and then tell us about this second expansion?
Sure. And once again, I'm going to just give you a rough year. It's not an exact year because we don't have the kind of tools to give us exact years, but roughly 2625 is when I would date the Uruk expansion. So this was the second of two outward movements of people from southern Mesopotamia. And this is the movement that I connect to the activity in the Bible that I like to refer to as the post-Babel dispersion. It's when people all scattered because they couldn't speak to one another as they had before, and that freaked them out. Let's put it in easy terms. They were just beside themselves. They couldn't continue to be around people they couldn't communicate with. So they moved to different places. And so the Uruk expansion is that second outward movement of people from Mesopotamia that we can then connect with. Well, we can put it on trial as an option and say, could this be the post-Babel dispersion? And Clayton, here's where we see the kinds of things I think, would expect with what would have happened when people all of a sudden, for the first time in the history of the world, could not communicate with one another. So the Uruk expansion, it's characterized by this: colonial expansion. And so that's kind of a beginning point. And then the end point on the dial is intrusive invasion, right?
Yeah,
So
so okay.
invasion.
So you're talking about an expansion, an invasion. So when we read the Bible, we see that man's language was confused, and so they were scattered. And so we have to do a lot of work ourselves to try to say, okay, what's this look like? What's going on? So you've looked in the archaeological record. You're looking at this Uruk expansion that's happening sometime in the 26th century BC, and you're saying this appears to be where it happened. What does such an expansion look like in the ground as opposed to in the text? I mean, I'm sure they're going to match up, but what are we looking for in the ground now?
Yeah, and basically there are, well, and what we want to start with is to try to figure out what's going on with the Uruk expansion, right? So with the Uruk expansion, there were essentially three models, right? Of at least three models, three that I could come up with, three different models, three different plans, three different ways of people living once they have emigrated from their place of origin and moved to somewhere else. And so the first one is a type of colonial expansion that involves building on virgin soil. And there's a perfect example of this. There's a type site for this in ancient Syria, quite a bit south of Degir-Mentepe, which is where I said the site was that acts as a type site for, or one of the type sites for the Ubaid expansion. But the site where they're building on virgin soil with the Uruk expansion is called Habuba Kabira. Habuba Kabira. And that site is fascinating because they build walls, Clayton. Well, during the Ubaid expansion, we have no evidence of wall building. So when the people moved to other places, if it was on virgin soil or there was already a population there and they moved there, there were no city walls built to protect them from intruders or invaders. It was very peaceful. But with Habuba Kabira, we see a totally different model now. We see a defensive city wall built around Habuba Kabira, which in itself is fascinating, which implies to us that these people were afraid that they could be attacked by local inhabitants, right? Well, that's very different than the model that we saw with the Ubaid expansion, where everyone theoretically was still speaking one language, and because of that lack of a communication barrier, I think they got along fine, and there was really no need for fear of attacking one another. But Clayton, if you can't speak the same language and you move to a place where there are, from your perspective, foreigners who don't speak your language, don't share your culture, don't do things the way that you do, there is automatically a tension. There's an underlying tension. And that tension is exhibited, I think, in different ways. It creates the possibility that there could be fighting or battle or war between one another, right? And so the way to stop that, you build a city wall. And at Habuba Kabira, you see all of the what we call diagnostic features of the Ubaid expansion. We see things like bevel rim bowls. We see four lug jars. We see red lug jars. We see drooping spouted jars. All of these very specific types of pottery that are in southern Mesopotamia in the late Uruk period, and that's the time period that's matched with the Uruk expansion. We find that same, what we call material culture. So they made their cups like, when they moved elsewhere, they made the cups the same as they were used to making cups, and saucers and plates and bowls and tools and weapons and architectural type things such as stone mosaic cones were used in buildings in places like Habuba Kabira. So it's clear as mud that we have a transplanting of people from southern Mesopotamia to this site, a site on virgin soil. So that's the first model, the virgin
Right.
soil.
And so you're using material culture such as walls. I know one of the earliest walls we see is at the city of Jericho. I don't know how that matches up with this period, but you're talking about other items, like specific things, like a type of bowl, these bevel rim bowls that you're talking about. And these are made in a mold, correct? They have a similar shape.
That's
And
it.
it's at this point in history where you see them spreading out from this central region of Mesopotamia, correct?
That's right. Yes.
Wow, so that helps us to follow a literal trail. It is a trail of artifacts that are left behind by people who are moving out of the region, and they're bringing artifacts that are the same style they had, and they're bringing architecture like the walls that they use, these defensive walls. But that shows a difference in people groups, whether it's ethnicity or language or whatever. So you're seeing things from multiple areas that point to something like we read about in Genesis and about the expansion from Babel.
Yeah, and these are culturally the same people who are moving to these other sites throughout the ancient world in all directions, and I'm just giving you one direction, right? And then Clayton, the second model that we see is is a segregated colony. That's the second model. So what does that mean? Well, if you again you go back to sites like Degirmentepe and Tepe Gara, if people from southern Mesopotamia moved there, right, during the Ubaid period, during the Ubaid expansion, they integrated among those people. They had houses with common walls, but the Uruk expansion was a totally different model. And Hassenebi Tepe is a good example of this. And this also is in Upper Syria, ancient Upper Syria. And at Hassenebi Tepe, you had literal segregated living. What does that mean? Well, most of us are from the United States, and we know a little bit about, if not a lot, about our early history. And one of the things that happened in our early history is people from usually Europe came over, cultures with certain languages and certain cultural backgrounds. They came by ship and they relocated to the United States. And usually they would go to places where they could kind of make a life for themselves. And oftentimes they ended up going to places like New York City and Boston and Philadelphia. And what happened, Clayton, is we got we got boroughs, or we got sections of the city that reflected certain individual cultural groups and language speaking groups all clumped together. So, for example, you have one part of town where they're all the Italians, and over here are all the Irish, and over here are all the Germans, and then here are all the Dutch, right? And on and on and on. So that very model, and that happened naturally, right? Nobody forced that on anybody. It happened naturally because the people who came over here, they didn't want to have to, well, number one, they came knowing they don't know the local people, they don't know the local culture, they don't know the native tongue, they don't know the trade language, which eventually became English, right? They don't know all of those things. So what's easiest and best for them then is to huddle together and stay together and protect each other and live in small areas. And that became a natural segregated living in the history of the United States. And it's all based on language, the language barrier. So the fact that at Hassanebi Tepe we have that same model is illuminating. So when people from southern Mesopotamia moved to Hassanebi Tepe and they settled there, and there was already a settlement here, right? So it wasn't virgin soil. The local people stayed in their own local area, but the southern Mesopotamians, the Urukians, we can call them, when they moved to Hassanebi Tepe, they built their own neighborhoods. So they had their own borough and they had their own trash dump. These people didn't even share the same trash dump as the locals. What does that tell you? It tells you that there's a conflict between them. It tells you there's a lack of harmonious connectedness between them. So
Right.
this is the first probably major sign that we get that says, oh, now this seems to make sense if it matches the moment in biblical history when God confused the languages of the people there. And actually, the confusion of the languages happened not just there at the site, but all over the earth, the text says. According to what? According to families. And that's exactly what we read already in Genesis 10. There's an allusion to it before we even get to the narrative about the confusion of languages and the dispersion of people.
Okay, so these people have left Babel, they've taken their Babel culture, and they have established Babel Town, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and it's funny too, Clayton. You mentioned either earlier in this episode or in our last episode the idea of bitumen as the mortar that was used that's described in Genesis 11. And what we have at Hassanebi Tepe is fascinating. We have not only bevel rim bowls, but we have bevel rim bowls with bitumen in them, Clayton. The very material that the Bible says was used in southern Mesopotamia for mortar, right? And so that same exact material is found in bevel rim bowls at Hassanebi Tepe. That's that second model.
Wow. So you're holding us very close here now. We're coming up on the end of this episode, and we need to know. So you've got the Uruk Expansion. It's going all over the place. Where did it come from? Where is Babel?
Well, I'm going to save that for another episode, Clayton. I'm going to keep the viewers and the listeners in suspense here. But I want to mention to you in our last moments the final model that we see. That final model we see with the Uruk Expansion, it's called an invading colony of people from southern Mesopotamia, right? So it's actual invasion and attack. And the perfect example of this, it's a site called Hamukar. And when I was at the University of Toronto in my PhD program, my professor, Dr. Clemens Reichel, he was excavating at this very site of Hamukar, but a modern war broke out, the Syrian war broke out.
Wow. So segregated living, we have violence, all sorts of things showing that these people came in as invaders. Well, we are out of time for this episode, but we do plan to come back next week and continue the discussion about locating the Tower of Babel. Our guest is Dr. Douglas Petrovich. Thank you, Dr. Petrovich, for being here.
My pleasure, Clayton. Great to be with you as well.